As you probably know, I've been running my YouTube channel for years, and now I've resumed streaming again, starting over, because I feel like we need that shared space once more, you know? And it's not just that I influence my viewers, but they also influence me with their questions. And you start refining certain things, trying to become more aware. Now, on the contrary, my languages have gotten mixed up. So here's the story. So for all 3 years, unlike many Ukrainian viewers who unfortunately often fall victim to what we might call leftist propaganda, I'm not trying to say that the right is always right or that the left is always wrong. But the point isn't even about which side is right. It's that in recent years, the left has really started to, suffer from some kind of, how should I put it, a sort of communist affliction. And this is just such a tilt that society in America itself really wanted to correct. And you have to understand that, for example, it was clear to me even 3 years ago that, of course, Trump would win the election. From my point of view, I personally find his personality very appealing, his career, his general attitude toward life, the kinds of projects he did before, if anyone watched The Apprentice. I just think it was a brilliant project when, as a businessman, he helped other startups, that is beginners, immediately get a leg up, set up these career elevators, sell, say, orange juice on the street, depending on who did better. And then he would give the winner tremendous opportunities. You see, as a teacher myself, for example, I know how other teachers work and how I work. I work in such a way as to give the very best, all the tools to the one who might even surpass me. And it's a good thing if they become better than me. I flourish through them. But there are plenty of people who are like, so that's how it is. And sometimes there's even this kind of professional jealousy that prevents a teacher from fully realizing themselves. When I saw Trump's attitude toward his younger, essentially, competitor show, he gave them the green light, I realized that this person is incredibly talented. Only a truly talented person, when seeing someone else's talent, can admire it rather than envy it. And as I was following his, biography, of course, and the interviews he gave a long time ago to Oprah Winfrey and so on, how handsome and just so charismatic. And I realized that basically he has huge ambitions. So he's appealed to me for a long time, let's put it that way. So being surprised that I also allowed for the possibility. I thought maybe it's because I like him, I want things to turn out that way. And maybe really it just seems that way to me, but I was so sure about it, he would win. And so he does win. For all these 3 years on the channel, I hosted American Roller Coaster with US Navy Captain First Rank Harry Taba. So we kept talking about all of this, telling these stories. Thanks to these programs, I learned a lot for myself because, it was simply the best lecture series on American politics for me. And so now, I hope that to some extent I've immersed myself in how Trump roughly makes decisions, and maybe I'll be able to talk with you now about how I intuitively feel about it. Here's what's happening right now. Let's talk about it using the recent events in Iran as an example. He gave this terrorist Ayatollah 60 days, how should I put it? He used a military tactic, an old one, even a kind of tradition. I think he's actually a Chinese invention. They would build what was called the golden bridge for the enemy. That is, they would build golden because it was very costly. They would build an escape route for them so that when the enemy found themselves in complete isolation and under threat of total destruction, it was better to give them that golden bridge so they could retreat and in dying cause less harm to their own military. It seems to me that this golden bridge tactic is very much present in his approach. He tries to offer it until the very last moment. When does it not work? And here it's very important to understand when exactly it doesn't work. So look, Iran, I think our viewers know until 1979 was a prosperous, beautiful country. Fashionable women wore short skirts. Everyone went there to study and vice versa and so on. So Shah Pahlavi, who as a result of a coup when religious fanatics, maniacs, terrorists came to power and basically plunged the country into this darkness for 50 or however many years it's been now lost his country, the Shah ended up in exile. He continued to be the Shah. Of course, he was granted asylum in the United States because he was very close with the United States. And now so many years have passed. Now there is the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. He's a very charismatic, very wise politician, speaks many languages fluently, supports Israel, and attends all the important events that take place there. And several months ago, Trump's team met with him in Paris. After that, we thought, well, it would be interesting to see how things develop from here. Some people say, come on, we've been waiting and waiting for Trump to help, and nothing is happening. Others are already starting to, well, spread all sorts of things. Forget it, he won't help. He abandoned everything. And then it turns out that it wasn't for nothing that Trump left the G7 a little early. So he really did prepare an outstanding operation, as a result of which not only was, well, I guess you could say the Iranian nuclear program was destroyed. And you have to understand this is, well, this is atomic, this is a weapon that they, under the guise of something else, let's dig a little deeper into this topic as well. So now they say that 3 sites have supposedly been destroyed. But Bushehr, of course, which I also consider important and hoped later maybe it will still happen, that's also important, because that's exactly where they've been cooperating very closely and for a long time with the Fascist Federation. Because during the period when Kirienko headed that Rumpelstiltskin, when he was in charge of Rosatom well, I won't go into too much detail about the career progression of this Rumpelstiltskin right now, but that was one of his positions. From a common sense perspective, he should have been cursed by the people he robbed blind several times over, but nevertheless. And it was precisely at that time that Israeli intelligence reported that under the guise of this equipment supposedly for the construction of Frozen E, that is this nuclear power plant in Bushehr, because it was one Siemens who started it before, well, the revolution in '79. And so under the pretense of supposedly resuming construction, they were actually supplying centrifuges for uranium enrichment there. And all this is happening because of the water border, the Caspian Sea, and they all talked about this, warned about it since those quite distant times. At first, people just didn't pay any attention to it. Then they started to listen, and later it turned out that the Israelis were right about everything. And so that's why such a military operation, which in just a few days deprives them of these main, locations and 30 IRGC generals, there has never been anything like this before. Because, you know, throughout human history, there have been wars where, yes, sometimes millions of soldiers die and so on. But if you count specifically the number of generals killed even during World War II, I think there were fewer. And here it happened in just a few days. So, of course, this is an outstanding, lightning fast and targeted assistance and so on. Yes, I do want them to see it through to the end so that finally the Shahu, the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi can return. Maybe the monarchy won't be restored. Maybe he'll be elected president. That's also a decision for the Iranian people themselves. There is a very strong opposition there, and there are very courageous women who, knowing they could be executed, still go out and protest. So, as we can see, they were given 60 days, and on the 61st day, their patience ran out. A lightning-fast targeted strike was carried out well. They've never been shaken up like this before. But now, apparently, the Trump administration wants the internal Iranian opposition to do something on their end. Even political prisoners who are in jail are helping them. They destroyed the gates with a targeted strike there. These, how should I put it? Fortresses, the entrance was hit to give them a chance to get out, to give them an opportunity to start taking action. So this is now the strategy, so that it's not just imposed in some way, and so that there's less, do you understand, to reduce these clashes. Because when even a collapsing regime still has some kind of illusion that it can still do something, it becomes, as I say, like without a golden bridge, it becomes like a rat that can leap to incredible heights, and so the clashes will be even harsher. But when they feel that the people themselves hate them, that the people themselves want to get rid of them, then they no longer have that kind of motivation. And basically they become open to some kind of agreements. So, but what interests us more, this was just an example we've discussed. What interests us more is what will happen next with terrorist Russia. And, sanctions are a huge step forward. What would they gain from it? Look, before Biden imposed direct sanctions, which, as we can see, allow, including by various criminal means, to circumvent them one way or another and still manage to get by. Trump acts in two ways. First, before starting an operation, it's just that these things are very connected. I can't separate one from the other. Before starting the operation to, overthrow the Iranian Ayatollah regime, because that's how I see it, even though it's officially called the destruction of Iran's nuclear program. But these things, they are practically the same: terrorists and weapons and terrorists, that's it. So how does it work? I mean, Iran, by the way, Iran had a bunch of sanctions imposed on it, which also didn't really work, because the Biden administration, for some reason, unfroze billions of dollars for them. We already discussed all this on the roller coaster with Harry, so I won't waste our time on it now. So why is that? Because even with direct measures, they still managed to find some loopholes. So in order for sanctions to really work well, for anything to work effectively against Russia, oil prices would also have to fall.
Yeah.
Despite the operation that needs to be carried out, why did he want it to be lightning fast? Why did he first visit all the countries that historically might not have supported him? Anything could have happened. But in this case, he managed to reach an understanding with them.
What a multi-step plan.
Exactly. So that the end, he asked them not to let prices spike during this operation, because this price spike feeds all these dictators, and Putin in particular. And indeed, there was only a slight fluctuation, and then it went back down again. So it's very important for the global oil price environment to be low. And for the Russian industry, critical threshold is, as Ukrainian diplomats correctly point out from time to time, because this threshold is already being calculated. Because how does it work? First, there's depreciation, the Soviet era, and so on. So it's kind of, why is that? Because they managed what they inherited from the Soviet Union incompetently. As a result, their oil has a very high production cost, even their heavy and dirty oil, so to speak, compared to Brent from Arab countries, which is light and clean. And in extraction, it costs, say, $5 there, right? Moreover, Aramco, the largest oil company, was once established in Saudi Arabia with American assistance. So it's very interesting how the Americans helped their closest partners develop. Why am I glad that Ukraine made a deal on rare earth metals? Because every time someone enters into a partnership with the Americans ensure the prosperity of their partner country. So here we are dealing with the fact that he absolutely needs the market situation to go down, because as long as this whole game with the shadow fleet continues, it only creates additional, corrupt connections for Russia all over the world.
Excuse me.
So what are they doing?
Let me remind you, Estonia actually tried to stop the tanker sent in the end. Fighter jets were scrambled, and there was a threat.
I'll explain what they're doing now. They set a price cap of $60 for Russian trade, even though the global market situation is higher. In other words, they find loopholes somehow, using a shadow fleet to keep selling, transferring oil, and so on. Moreover, they even escort these ships with military vessels, which of course only escalates the situation in the Baltic Sea. What's more, their appetite grows as they eat, since they've already become so brazen in the Baltic Sea with their battleships. Why not also consider that other vile operation of theirs, the so-called Suwałki corridor? So at the same time, these tankers or battleships would block the Baltic Sea, thereby putting the Baltic states under even greater threat and isolating them even further. In other words, as long as they don't get an immediate slap on the wrist, their feverish imagination just keeps running wild. So in this situation, with this price cap in place, it was essentially the wrong strategy. What needs to happen is for global sanctions to push prices below the threshold at which it is profitable for them. So right now we're talking about a figure of $35 to $36. So if we achieve this, meaning if the international community, and in particular, if anyone is really pushing for this, it's President Trump. He is the one who is specifically working to drive oil prices lower and lower. And so the margin that arises between $5, which is the production cost in Arab countries, and $35, which is the survival threshold for this Russian terrorist economy. So any figure, any atoll will do. It's just a matter of time. The lower it is, the faster Russia will collapse. So the next question is, what exactly are secondary sanctions in this context? So in principle, is this the most optimal strategy? Secondary sanctions are what will help speed things up, because as for having a direct sharp impact, the drop has already been very steep. That is, there has already been a sharp plunge downward, and today's threshold is already much lower than what they had budgeted for. In terms of economic activity and the incompetence of their management, they've already failed. Now, how they'll patch things up is unclear, because they've already used up a lot of their various funds and so on. At this point, it's a patchwork quilt, a Trishkin kaftan. It's not so easy to just swap pieces around anymore. But now the trend is that it will keep going lower and lower. This is causing panic. And at this moment, the baseball bat of secondary sanctions comes into play. So what's the point? And why couldn't people expect President Trump to act quickly and immediately on this? Let me explain. Because secondary sanctions are essentially imposed on those countries that trade with Russia. At the same time, this damages, let's say, the trade relations between the United States and those countries. And in cases where these countries, for some reason, sometimes even for objective reasons, but ultimately due to their own previous short-sightedness, because they shouldn't have gotten hooked on this energy needle, including uranium, since many countries still use it. And it's this sort of average Kazakh-Russian mix. Actually, there are many joint ventures, because much more uranium is mined in Kazakhstan. So essentially, Russia in this context is just an intermediary. In reality, the world doesn't even need it. And if Europeans had thought pragmatically from the very beginning, this problem wouldn't have arisen. But since they built so much around the idea of this trade, it became very difficult to abruptly break away from it under the threats of American sanctions. Wait, that's not all. And what if these countries just smile, formally say, yes, yes, but in reality start thinking, no, this doesn't work for us? Will these sanctions be effective? Will they achieve their intended result? And this is especially relevant, of course, when it comes to China. Right now, maybe, there's still some European dependence, probably on certain energy resources, right? So in this sense, there is a smooth transition and a certain selectivity. Moreover, they've brought the situation to the point where those countries that, although it looks absurd on the one hand, are somehow supporting the Russian economy, and on the other hand, are helping Ukraine with weapons, financial aid, and much more. So regarding these countries, there should be a period when they are given the opportunity to completely break free from this dependence, precisely because their moral stance is clear. And accordingly, if you start acting with a heavy hand, acting in a blunt, forceful way, it's not certain that this will work with China. This is probably the key issue right now, because it needs to be done in such a way that China also agrees with this position. In other words, essentially everything depends on the conversation that will take place soon between President Trump and Xi Jinping. They have a meeting scheduled. I think the effectiveness of these secondary sanctions will depend on the outcome of that meeting. And Trump needs them to work very effectively. That's why now, ahead of his visit and meeting with the Chinese leader, it seems he has already reached a certain understanding at the level of the negotiating teams. And that's why he's telling Lindsey Graham, of course, Trump is also very emotionally supportive of Ukraine. There, when he had a meeting with Chancellor Merz, which went very well, journalists asked him directly, so are you with Ukraine? Of course I'm with Ukraine. I just signed a big deal with them, but what's the point here? You can see it in him emotionally every time whenever another atrocity happens, like, for example, what happened last night, or actually the night before last. You can really tell that he is truly furious about these monstrous crimes. And it's clear that he was, to some extent, seeking a unified position on this issue so that together with China, they could really and effectively apply this very, very tough mechanism. So apparently, at the level of the negotiating teams, there is already an understanding. That's why he tells Lindsey Graham, all right, we're ready to support, so I support you holding a vote in Congress. We know that Senator Lindsey Graham has already said that 84 senators support this, so it's very likely that it will pass the vote. Well, I think actually most likely I always say it cautiously. Well, we think that's how it will be. And the main thing is, of course, after that, the law, or rather, these sanctions are signed by the president. Well, that's the procedure.
Will Russia have any leeway? Just a quick remark, will there be any leeway between the vote in Congress and Trump signing this to do something?
Most likely, they won't have any leeway. Moreover, he said that they are irreversible. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he said that they are irreversible. And that's why, of course, there is a certain flexibility built into them, because when such a mechanism, such a colossal one, is introduced, of course, for it to work like clockwork, there probably needs to be some way to adjust or regulate this mechanism, especially when it's just starting out. Because I am certain of this. The sanctions that so far have not strangled, for example, Iran or Russia well, in this case, Trump will demonstrate a master class in how sanctions should actually work. He is an ambitious person, as we both know very well. And I think now he will show how it's really supposed to be done. Because when he imposed those kinds of secondary sanctions against Venezuela, they actually worked. The same thing. You see how he acts lightning fast, effective, quick, and so decisive.
Amazing.
I think what we really need now, it would be great if, of course, at this very moment, Trump isn't scrolling through the news and probably isn't watching our broadcast, unfortunately. But these voters, there are a lot of people from the diaspora, many people who have left and so on. They are watching how things are in Ukraine, how the information space is being shaped and what is being said about all of this. And if there were a bit more discussion in the way we're talking right now, things would move much faster and more efficiently. But unfortunately, there is still some kind of hypnosis in the information space, maybe from Soros foundations or USAID, I don't know. And supposedly the funding has already been reduced, but somehow things are still dragging on out of habit. And there's a constant information attack. And most importantly, it's done in very unflattering terms.
You see, let me explain this to you in this context. If there had been a more adequate explanation, a clearer, deeper one, like the one you just gave, I think people wouldn't have so many questions. Because as I was listening to you, I was genuinely impressed and thought, my God, in this context, a person like that deserves not just one Nobel Peace Prize, but 2 or 3, if he manages to achieve all this. Because on the one hand, this person is weaving an incredible web in the best sense of the word. And on the other hand, he's boiling that frog that is Putin. Let me just remind the viewers that it's usually easy to boil a frog, because if you heat the water slowly, it could jump out. But since the water is gradually warmed up, the frog just falls asleep. So essentially, with these statements like saying, I have a great relationship with Putin, let's bring Russia back into the G7 to make it the G8 again. And then somehow
Again, on the surface, there's nothing like that, right?
And at the same time, on one hand, he's boiling the frog, and on the other, he's weaving these remarkable, absolutely stunning schemes, such multi-layered moves that it's hard to even imagine. So, yes, that is, for example, I can say that after your words, my opinion of Trump has really changed significantly. And if all of this really does start working in the near future, then of course I'll be giving him a standing ovation.
And tell me, what would have happened if Trump hadn't sanctioned Nord Stream during his last term? Do you understand that it was thanks to what he did? I mean, the Europeans didn't want this, they resisted.
Of course. Listen, if Germany was planning to just sit,
Merkel personally resisted and absolutely did not want this. He was prepared for a cooling of relations with Merkel, even for them to become downright bad, you could say. But he needed to do this because basically he's right when he says there wouldn't have been this war if he had been president in 2020, because he specifically wouldn't have allowed the dictator Putin to be overfed with easy money. He understood that war is about money. No money, no war. In the case of the maniac Putin, who in principle, he says, I always knew what he wanted, but I would not let him do it.
yeah,